Where's the lady over here from? No. Ready? For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 145 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 10, House Resolution 145. Resolved that at any time after adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill, H.R. 8, to require a background check for every firearm sale. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment to the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary, now printed in the bill, it shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-5. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. All points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute are waived. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in Part A of the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. All points of order against such amendments are waived. At the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, the committee shall rise and report the bill to the House with such amendments as may have been adopted. Any member may demand a separate vote in the House on any amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole to the bill or to the amendment in the nature of a substitute made in order as original text. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2. At any time after adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 1112 to amend Chapter 44 of Title 18 United States Code to strengthen the background check procedures to be followed before a federal firearms licensee may transfer a firearm to a person who is not such a licensee. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and amendments specified in this section and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary, now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-6 shall be considered as adopted in the House and in the Committee of the Whole. The bill as amended shall be considered as the original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill as amended are waived. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part B of the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution. Each such further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. All points of order against such further amendments are waived. At the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, the committee shall rise and report the bill as amended to the House with such further amendments as may have been adopted. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill as amended and on any further amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 hour.
Mr. Speaker, for the purposes of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentlewoman from Arizona, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of the resolution, all time yielded is for the purposes of debate only. I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection, gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the Rules Committee met and reported a rule, H.R. 145, providing for consideration of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019, and H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019. The rule provides for consideration of each bill under a structured rule. The rule also provides 1 hour of general debate on each bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019 and the Enhanced Background Check Act of 2019 arrive at a time of emergency for America, a real emergency. Every year, 120,000 Americans are shot in our country, and 35,000 of them are shot dead. 17,000 of the people wounded or killed each year are children or teenagers, their families devastated, their lives forever changed. In 2017, gun deaths in America hit the highest level in 40 years with 40,000 Americans killed. We've lost more Americans to gun violence in our own communities than to the Vietnam War, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Iraq War, the Afghan War combined. And this war at home never stops. Each day, yesterday, today, tomorrow, another 100 people in America are shot and killed by gun violence. Mr. Speaker, this is not a global problem. It's an American problem. While 35,000 Americans are killed by gunfire here each year, it's 146 people in the United Kingdom, 142 in Portugal, 30 in Japan. We lose more people to gun violence in a single weekend than England loses all year. We lost more people in the Las Vegas massacre alone in one bloody night than the nation of Japan lost to gun violence in 8 years. No other developed high-income country's lethal gun violence even comes close to the American carnage allowed by our loophole-ridden gun laws. The gun-related murder rate in the United States is 25 times higher than the average of other high-income countries and hundreds of times higher than some of them. Now, the good news is that we know what to do to begin to end this crisis. We must close the loopholes. In 1994, the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act went into effect and required licensed firearm dealers to contact the FBI to run a background check through the NICS system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. The Brady Act made it illegal to sell a firearm to felons, to fugitives, to people who've been committed to mental institutions, to drug addicts, to domestic abusers, to undocumented immigrants, and to other disqualified categories. The Brady Act worked as far as it went. It has stopped more than 3 million illegal purchases of firearms by convicted felons, violently abusive partners, fugitives, the mentally ill, and so on. But there are gaping loopholes in the law because unlicensed gun sellers, the people who sell guns online today or at gun shows or in other private transactions, can sell firearms without having to run any background check whatsoever. More than 1/5 of U.S. gun owners acquired their most recent firearm without any background check at all, which means that millions of people obtain millions of firearms without going through the Brady system. And people who commit gun crimes overwhelmingly obtain their firearms from the unlicensed sources. A 2013 study found that 80% of all firearms acquired for criminal purposes were obtained from sources that were not required to go through the background check. The criminals are not stupid. They follow the loopholes. They go to the internet, they go to the gun shows, they go to the convenience store parking lots to get their weapons of mass destruction without any background check at all. Our legislation will close these dangerous loopholes by guaranteeing that there's a thorough NICS background check on every gun sale or transfer, with only a few carefully defined exceptions for intra-family gifts and a few other cases. There are three primary things you need to know about this legislation. One, it is backed by more than 90% of the American people, fully 97% of Americans, including 97% of gun owners, 97% of Republicans, 99% of Democrats. It is the very essence of common sense, the sense we all have in common, to make the background check system comprehensive and universal, leak-proof, foolproof, not ridden by the loopholes. A background check doesn't work if criminals know that there are massive and lawful ways to cheat and get around it. So America today stands up to close the loopholes. And that is why this is a day of great triumph for the gun safety movement that has swept America in response to Parkland and Las Vegas and Newtown and the other massacres that our people have endured. Second, this legislation is perfectly constitutional. As Justice Scalia found for the Supreme Court in the DC versus Heller decision, the Second Amendment permits reasonable regulation to exclude from gun ownership violent felons, the mentally unstable, and so on. Despite all of the solemn invocations of the Second Amendment that we continue to hear bouncing off of the walls of Congress, the opponents of this legislation could not muster a single witness to actually argue that this legislation is unconstitutional. And that includes the George Mason University Antonin Scalia School of Law professor of constitutional law and the Second Amendment, who was brought in and just expressed her policy misgivings about the bill without articulating any constitutional analysis at all, and rejected the opportunity to say that this legislation is unconstitutional. The reason 97% of Americans favor this legislation is because it is perfectly consistent with the letter and spirit of the Second Amendment, and it sweepingly advances public safety at the same time. This bill finally will dramatically lower gun violence in America. More than 90% of Brady background checks take less than 90 seconds to complete. But these checks have literally stopped more than 3 million illegal gun purchases by felons and fugitives and domestic offenders, the violently mentally ill, undocumented aliens, and so on. Every day, background checks stop 170 felons and 50 domestic abusers from purchasing a gun. Imagine how much more effective this system will be when we close these gaping loopholes. And yet, even in the face of the shocking death toll, which distinguishes our society from the other wealthy societies on earth, despite the overwhelming public support for this legislation, and despite its clear constitutionality, our friends across the aisle oppose closing the internet, the gun show, and the private sale loopholes. Instead of getting on our side to close the loopholes, what do they give us? More loopholes. They brought us dozens of amendments to try to suggest more loopholes to the current law. That's obviously not the direction that America needs to go in, and you'll hear some more about that today. They have given us a veritable loophole factory, but now is the time to close loopholes, not reproduce them. Let's focus on the public safety, which is the cardinal purpose of law and the social contract in a democratic society. Let's pass this excellent bill, and let's pass H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019, which closes the Charleston loophole, the loophole that made it possible for a guy to go out and get a gun because the dealer decided to give him a gun after 3 days because they were still doing a background check. And this loophole says if it's taken 3 days or more, then you have a right to go ahead and get your gun. We're going to close that one, this so-called default proceed provision. We're going to close that one too, so that we don't see any repeat massacres like the one that took place in June of 2015 at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I will, at this point, reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank Mr. Raskin for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All of us, Republicans and Democrats, want to reduce gun violence. I think there's just a difference of opinion on how we get there. Unfortunately, H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112, although well-intentioned, will not reduce gun violence, as Mr. Raskin said. And instead, it will turn everyday, law-abiding individuals into criminals and could actually do more harm than good. You know, I grew up in a family that didn't have guns. After my dad returned from World War II, he stopped hunting. And so because I wasn't around them, I have to admit I had an irrational fear of guns for a while. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I got educated. I remember I first went to a debate where the person that was talking for gun rights said, you know, who follows the laws? Law-abiding people follow the laws. Who doesn't follow the laws? Criminals do not follow the laws. So although well-intentioned, often laws are unenforceable and criminals just do not follow them. H.R. 8, again, I believe is well-intended, but it will not solve the problem. H.R. 8 would not have prevented any of the mass shootings in the last 20 years. Not one of them. I studied them because I'm in the Judiciary Committee along with Mr. Raskin, and we heard this bill in that committee. In most cases, guns were obtained legally. Recent attackers have passed background checks to acquire their firearms, including the attackers at the Thousand Oaks, California shooting, the Tree of Life Synagogue, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania shooting, the attacker in the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, Parkland, Florida shooting, and the shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and the Las Vegas, Nevada shooting. None of these attacks would have been prevented if H.R. 8 or H.R. 1112 were law. Then the attackers in the Columbine High School, Colorado shooting used straw purchases for their weapons, an act that is already illegal and has been illegal since at least the 1960s. Adam Lanza, the attacker in the Sandy Hook Elementary School, Newtown, Connecticut shooting, used his mother's firearms, which were legally purchased by his mother. So as you can see, and I have each one of them listed how the attackers got their guns. H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112 would not have prevented any of these shootings. Not only would none of the mass shootings be prevented by H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112, but the Department of Justice under President Obama said that in order for universal background checks to actually work and be enforceable, a federal gun registry is needed. Yet this legislation in H.R. 8 specifically prohibits a registry. Thus, again, it is unenforceable. The fact is, criminals don't get their guns legally and will not go through a background check to get their guns, even if this bill was signed into law. A recent Department of Justice report of prison inmates that used guns in their crimes showed that 56% obtained their guns illegally and another 25% received them from family members, which, by the way, family members are still allowed to get the guns under this law. It is obvious then that they did not get their guns from a gun show or private sales, as Mr. Raskin is concerned about. H.R. 8 will also turn everyday law-abiding citizens into criminals if it becomes law. Let's look at the amendments that were rejected by the Democrats in Rules Committee and in judiciaries that offered to protect law-abiding citizens from becoming criminals. First, there was an amendment, I thought common sense, that someone thinking of committing suicide would be exempted from temporarily turning over their gun to a friend, and it's not allowed under this bill. They would become a criminal. So somebody that wants to commit suicide could not transfer their gun to someone else. If a law-abiding citizen wanted to let someone temporarily use their gun on their own property, they would become a criminal under this bill. If a farmer or rancher wanted to temporarily lend a gun to a ranch hand for the purposes of ranch activities, the farmer would become a criminal under this law. If a domestic violence victim was in fear of her life and wanted to temporarily borrow a gun from a friend to protect herself, she would become a criminal under this law. Let's also look at some common sense amendments rejected by the Democrats that would have prevented undue burdens and duplication on law-abiding citizens that have already passed a background check, but now have to go through another background check under this law. People who have security clearances. This is the application to get a government security clearance. Page upon page, background check, extensive background check. Yet someone who has this and has gone through this still has to get another background check. People who have a concealed carry weapon issued by a state, they have to go through another background check. People who have already gotten a gun permit from states that require them, they have to go through another background check. People who have global entry, who have gone through a background check, they've got to do it again under this bill. Even law enforcement officers have to go through another background check under this bill. This is placing undue burden on law-abiding citizens. Now, I want to share testimony from a young woman in the Judiciary Committee. This woman was a victim of rape on her college campus. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because well-meaning gun control laws actually prevented her from carrying a gun to school because the state she traveled through did not allow her to carry a gun in order to defend herself. This is a clear example of how law-abiding citizens, not criminals, law-abiding citizens who follow the law, and how this young woman and others like her was actually harmed by well-intentioned gun control laws. As a survivor of domestic violence, I know all too well how hard it can be to protect oneself or find a lifeline out. Your abuser, my abuser, often controlled all my finances. I wouldn't have been able to pay for a background check or a gun. Sometimes getting a gun from a friend could actually be your only option. Yet, unfortunately, under this bill, I tried to offer an amendment, but it was rejected. Now let's turn to H.R. 1112, which changes the length of time that a background check has to be completed from the current 3 days to 10 business days, and then another 10 business days for an appeal. So it could be 20 plus days. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I want to tell you a story, a real story about Carol Bone. She was a New Jersey woman who was stabbed to death while waiting to be approved for her firearm application. She already had an order of protection through the courts, But that wasn't enough. She needed more than just that piece of paper. HR 1112 will make the realities of Carol's story happen across the country, putting millions of women and law-abiding citizens in danger. Women who seek avenues of protection will be forced to wait almost a month, 20 days to a month, like Carol. How many women will potentially suffer like Carol? HR 8 also has other problems. Unfortunately, the debate in Judiciary Committee was cut short. Many common sense amendments were not even heard. Only 10 amendments out of 100 were heard before the chairman cut off debate. Because of the rush to get this bill through, there's another problem. There's vague language that is not defined and thus is open to interpretation. And so I know in some of the amendments, the majority party has tried to give an alternative to my good common sense domestic violence amendments, but it doesn't do any good. And this is the reason. It's because the language is so vague. It says, under HR 8, a person is allowed to temporarily transfer a firearm if it is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm. The question is, there's no definition of this. So how long is temporary transfer? Who determines that? Does the victim determine it? Who determines if there is imminent death? Does it qualify if a victim of domestic violence thinks they will be killed? Or does the person transferring the gun have to be in the same room and there be some kind of shootout and they throw a gun to them? What does imminent danger and imminent death mean? With something as important as the Second Amendment, I think we owe it to the American people to do our work and take as long as we have to in order to have a fair and open debate on major pieces of legislation. With that, I urge opposition to the rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first thing I'd like to do is to submit for the record a statement by the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, which is in favor of this legislation and against any weakening amendments. And just to quote a small part of it, firearms pose a significant danger to victims of domestic violence, and this is true no matter who owns the firearm. Research shows that a male abuser's access to a firearm increases the risk of intimate partner femicide fivefold and does not support the contention that firearm possession is a protective factor for the victim. And so there's more in here of interest, but I'd like to—
without objection.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my distinguished colleague from Arizona for her thoughts on the question of sexual and domestic violence. We indeed have a provision within the legislation which allows for an exemption from the background check requirement in cases of an imminent threat of great bodily harm. The question has been raised, does that include sexual assault, dating partner violence, stalking, and so on? We thought it was self-evident that it did, but in any event, Representatives Horn and from Oklahoma and Murphy from Florida are introducing a clarifying amendment to be very specific that it's included. So at that point, perhaps we could welcome the support of the distinguished gentlewoman from Arizona, because we're being very clear at that point that our exception for imminent bodily harm and violence includes sexual assault and so on. And I'm certain that your intentions are good, just as are the intentions of the authors of the amendment in the bill. But let me just address, in case you haven't decided to come over to our side now, address some of the general points that were made against the legislation. The gentlelady articulated an argument we've been hearing a lot of from our counterparts, which is that criminals don't follow the law, and therefore there's no reason to get rid of the loopholes and strengthen the law because criminals won't follow the law. Now, the fallacy of that argument is plain to see. It's an argument against all law. It's an argument against the law against murder, because murderers obviously don't follow the law against murder. It's an argument against the law opposed to theft, because thieves don't follow the law against theft. But I think Anyone who takes time to really study what law is understands that the purpose of the law is to deter people from negative, socially harmful action. The way that the Brady Act has deterred more than 3 million people, felons and fugitives and the mentally unstable and other unauthorized categories, from accessing a weapon. Now, that argument sweeps so broadly that it's an argument against having the Brady Act that we have now, and perhaps that's the intention, simply to take down the law that we've got now. The other purpose of law, of course, is to punish people who violate it, and then again to send a moral message about what the social norms are. And we've got social norms about driving, for example. Would we say we're not going to have driver's licenses in America because people who drive without a driver's license ignore the law requiring you to have a driver's license? It's a completely nonsensical argument. Let's come back to reality and talk about what the Brady Act actually requires the gun dealers to ask people. Here are the basic questions that are being asked. Are you under indictment for, or have you ever been convicted of, a felony? Are you a fugitive from justice? Are you an unlawful user of a controlled substance? Do you suffer from mental illness? Have you been dishonorably discharged from the armed forces? Are you subject to a court order restraining you from harassing, stalking, or threatening your child or an intimate partner? Have you ever been convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence? Have you renounced your United States citizenship? Are you unlawfully present in the United States? Those questions have created a dragnet that has allowed us to stop more than 3 million people from getting weapons who shouldn't have them. But there are these big gaping loopholes out there that they can go on the internet and get one, or they can go to the parking lot of a convenience store in a private sale and get one, or they can go to a gun show and negotiate a private sale and get one without having to answer those questions. Well, the American people have spoken on this. That's really why this is the first legislation advocating gun safety to hit the floor of the House of Representatives in a quarter of a century. This is a great day for the gun safety movement that has overtaken America, rejecting the unconscionable toll of 100 people dead every single day in communities across the land. With that, I'm going to yield to Mr. Thompson, the sponsor of the underlying bill, H.R. 8, who's done such a magnificent job advocating this cause through thick and thin.
I thank the gentleman
from California.
For 2 minutes. I will yield for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman
from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this rule and for the underlying legislation, a bipartisan measure that will make all of our communities safer and will save lives. I'd like to thank Chairman McGovern for his fair consideration of H.R. 8 and the proposed amendments that came before the Rules Committee. This is an important time in our nation's history. Over 80% of Americans have come together to support universal background checks. This is a new day, and this is a time to act now. Since the tragedy in Newtown about 6.5 years ago, this House has held 54 moments of silence, but we have not held one moment of action. With Speaker Pelosi's leadership, we now have a chance to vote for two bipartisan bills which will help save lives. As a gun owner and a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, I was proud to introduce H.R. 8 with my bipartisan colleagues. I look forward to its consideration tomorrow, and I urge my colleagues to support this rule today and the bill tomorrow, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields the balance of his time. Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 5 minutes to my good friend, the representative from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to voice my strong opposition to H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112. We all share the same goal to end gun violence. But in the course of this debate, House Democrats say they want to do something to end gun violence, and anyone who disagrees with their policies doesn't care. I believe in my heart that the gentleman from Maryland and the folks on the other side of this debate care about the victims of gun violence and the children in this country. And I know in my heart that my colleagues on this side of the aisle and I care too. It's a shame that in their rush to do something, anything, Democrats have made this a partisan show. They won't even allow my bipartisan concealed carry reciprocity bill that passed this House last Congress to be debated on the House floor today. What about the single mother victim of assault, like Shaneen Allen? Does she not have the right to defend herself? Instead of working on common sense solutions that can actually help prevent tragedies, like supporting local law enforcement, ensuring laws and protocols are followed, improving mental health, and implementing my concealed carry reciprocity, they're targeting law-abiding citizens. And they're disregarding existing federal law. There is no gun show loophole. Federal law already requires a background check on every commercial gun purchase in America, no matter where it takes place. Federal law already prohibits so-called straw purchases. Let's make one thing clear. H.R. 8 would not have stopped Newtown. H.R. 8 would not have stopped Parkland. It would not have stopped Las Vegas or Sutherland Springs or San Bernardino or the tragic attack on our former colleague, Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. But the proponents of gun control don't want you to judge them based on outcomes. They want you to judge them based on intentions. And they say anyone who points out the facts, anyone who dares observe the obvious flaws in their legislation, do so because they don't care. In their rush to do something, House Democrats ignore that House Republicans have done many things, like strengthening the background check system, which would have prevented Sutherland Springs, improving mental health care, which would have prevented many of these shootings, such as Newtown and Charleston and Parkland, and giving schools the tools they need to protect students. All these bills received bipartisan support in the last Congress, but we don't get credit for real action because they say our intentions weren't good enough. We owe it to the American people to look past the intention and the emotion and focus like a laser on outcomes. What can we do to actually end gun violence once and for all? So what is this bill actually going to do? It's going to turn a law-abiding American into a criminal when you loan your shotgun to your buddy to go dove hunting. It's going to make it illegal for a victim of stalking to borrow a gun from a neighbor for protection. It's going to make the cost of a background check so expensive that the average American can't afford to buy a gun. Meanwhile, criminals are going to continue to get their firearms, whether it's through theft or the black market or on the street. I applaud President Donald Trump for standing with us against this ineffective legislation, and I encourage my colleagues to vote no. The American people want us to work together to solve this problem and stop gun violence. Can't we come together in a bipartisan way and not just do something, but do something that will actually make a difference? I'm calling on my colleagues to put partisanship aside, work together on ideas that will actually make a difference. I stand ready to continue this work. I'll work with anyone to end gun violence while also protecting the rights of law-abiding citizens. And I reject the false dilemma that we can't do both. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is now recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I suppose that we are in a rush to do anything, anything that works in order to curb the terrible toll of gun violence in our society. Oh, in the last Congress, it's true, there was other legislation that was brought to us. One was a proposal to legalize silencers in America, which sounds to me more like an agenda of organized crime than it is of the U.S. Congress trying to seek public safety. But there was this bipartisan Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which was a massive assault on federalism and states' rights. It would have destroyed every state's concealed carry law in the country to level it at the lowest common denominator. So if you could get a license to carry a concealed loaded weapon in one state, and in some states there are more than 1 million people who've been able to get them through completely permissive and lax laws, then you could go anywhere in the country. That's their proposal. That's what's coming out of the loophole factory. I just would like to assure my friend that we have a provision in our legislation, if you read it carefully, which says that you can temporarily transfer a gun at a shooting range, at a shooting gallery, or for purposes of hunting. So you don't have to worry about this. Our friends are either not reading carefully enough or they're overlooking very clear passages in our legislation which deal with common sense concerns. This is bipartisan legislation. It is backed by more than 90% of the American people, and it's going to advance common safety. So rather than searching for mysterious reasons to oppose it, why shouldn't everybody get together to say this is something that will promote the public safety? With that, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank Mr. Raskin of the Rules Committee for yielding the time. I rise in strong support of this rule in H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act. Proud to be a co-sponsor, and I thank Congressman Thompson for his leadership. Our bill is intended to ensure that individuals who are prohibited from owning a firearm are not able to possess one. Rep. Raskin is right. America is in the midst of a gun violence emergency. Each year, 120,000 Americans are injured by firearm. 35,000 Americans die, and of those, 17,000 who are injured and killed are children. No other country in the world suffers the ravages of gun violence, and I'm afraid we've become numb to it. But we don't have to accept it, and we're not, because we're going to finally pass legislation here today. Mass shootings are on the rise. Military-style assault weapons are deadlier than ever. People are being gunned down in churches, schools, movie theaters, nightclubs, and synagogues. For so many years, the Republican-led Congress blocked action on common sense gun safety laws. But finally, to the American people, we heard you. To the students who marched for their lives, we're finally going to act. It's time now. I urge adoption of this bipartisan bill, the rule. It's a vote for the safety of our communities and our families.
Gentlewoman yields the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to address a couple things that were said previously. I had sponsored an amendment as a survivor of domestic violence to allow victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse who have orders of protection to be able to get transferred a gun if, you know, they might be in fear of their life. And as I've said, often victims of domestic violence don't have the financial means, or they're so restricted by their perpetrator that it's difficult for them to go out and purchase a gun, let alone get a background check. And so they might have a friend that they can borrow it from. Now, in response, I think Mr. Raskin, if I'm not mistaken, said that the Democrats did help domestic violence victims. And you know, I just don't think that their amendment cuts it. And I'm going to read the amendment if this is the one that you're talking about, Mr. Raskin. It says, a temporary transfer that is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm if the possession by the transferee lasts only as long as immediately necessary to prevent the imminent death or great bodily harm, and then here's the amendment, including the harm of domestic violence, dating partner violence, sexual assault, stalking, and domestic abuse. And I would say just because you add the words domestic violence, domestic victims of domestic abuse, doesn't mean this is going to help. And the reason is simply because of what I said before, is that these terms in here are really unclear. And I really would like somebody to explain, they're not defined anywhere. Who determines prevent imminent death or great bodily harm? And so let's say I am a victim of domestic violence and I think, you know, my perpetrator is going to kill me. Does imminent death, and in this word, say lasts only as long as immediately necessary to prevent the imminent death? So does that mean the person that my friend who can lend me a gun and, you know, has to be right there in the same room and see that there's imminent death coming? I mean, there is no definition here. And so it's unclear to me that this would help at all. Also, what is the definition of temporary transfer? How long is that? How long is temporary transfer? Does that mean, you know, just enough time you can throw somebody a gun while they're imminently in death? I mean, you have to be right there. What does this mean? There's no definition. So if we're going to proceed with this, I think that we should at least define what these terms mean. And therefore, I really wish that my amendment that said that victims of domestic violence or sexual abuse that have an order of protection through the court, would be allowed to at least borrow a gun to defend themselves from maybe a friend. And so with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. And I want to thank my colleague for advancing our discussion here, because I think now we're really starting to get somewhere. The gentlewoman suggested an amendment which allows for the transfer of a firearm to a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault who has an order of protection issued by a court. That's an extremely narrow exception. Most women who are enduring domestic violence don't have a civil protection order. Part of that is because of the incompetence of the laws in a lot of states, and part of it is because they haven't had the wherewithal to go get one. But our legislation and our amendment sweeps much more broadly. It allows any woman who is a victim of domestic violence, who faces a threat from their attacker, to be loaned a gun by a family member or be loaned a gun by a friend until the threat is resolved. But my friend suggests that there's something ambiguous about the words. I just don't see the ambiguity. Their original argument attacked the utility of all criminal law, saying we shouldn't have criminal laws essentially because criminals won't follow them. This seems like an attack on law itself. Law depends upon language, but the language is clear here that if there's a threat, and if you're suffering from the threat of domestic violence, sexual assault, and so on, then you can get the gun. Who interprets it? Well, you've got the right to go out and get it. If someone were to prosecute you for doing that, the prosecution would clearly lose. So I'm afraid that our friends are looking for problems in this bipartisan legislation which simply don't exist. With that, I'm going to yield a minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, my friend, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Asked to address the House for 1 minute. As a senior member on the Judiciary Committee and senior member on the Crime Committee, I too am glad of the underlying discussion regarding the protecting of women. But I rise today to support H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019, to close the gun show loopholes supported by 80% of the American people, so unlicensed dealers cannot undercover out of the back of their trunk sell to people who would create and perpetrate either mass murders or individual abuse and gun violence. I also support H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019, that would in fact have stopped the deaths at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where worshipers were shot down, 9 of them. To listen to the debate in the Judiciary Committee, 10 hours of rebuffing these simple legislative initiatives, I beg of my colleagues to stand with us. It is clear that we have an amendment, Horn and Murphy, that clarifies great bodily harm, includes domestic violence, dating partner violence, sexual assault, stalking, and domestic abuse. We want women to be protected and others involved in domestic abuse circumstances. My amendment that will be brought up as well will provide the information as to how many times the FBI have had to deal with petitions that have been denied. Let us not have another 20 years before we have bills that deal with gun safety legislation. Let's do it now. I yield back.
Gentlewoman, time has expired. Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to refute some of the things or talk about some of the things said by my friends on the other side. One of the things that I do want to talk about is that Mr. Raskin said that my amendment is such a narrow exception for domestic violence victims, but yet I had a broader one in Judiciary Committee, if you remember, and the chairman, Nadler, told me it was too broad, that I had to, it was too vague, and so that's why I made it very specific. If you'd like, I'd make it broad again. And also, in the Rules Committee, there was another amendment as well, and we're both on rules too, of course. And there was a broader one that said from Mr. Scalise, who is a victim of gun violence. He had an amendment that was ruled out of order. And that basically said that any victim of domestic violence, which was broad, but then he had another subsection that said victim of domestic violence or sexual abuse that has order of protection. So we covered both, yet it was ruled out of order. So we really tried. Now, the other thing that you brought up, that it's very clear what imminent danger means, and that would cover somebody, and surely, a domestic violence victim would not become a criminal under this law. Well, I don't think it's very sure. And so I asked Mr. Raskin, my colleague, if he would be open to removing the word imminent and just say danger instead of imminent danger. Because to me, imminent danger means you have to be right in the same room, and throw somebody a gun or something. I mean, to me, the word imminent needs to be removed from the language. The other thing I'd like to talk about is that a number of times now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said, oh, so many people support this universal background check. Well, I disagree. I disagree because there's proof right in Maine. They had a ballot measure and it was rejected by the majority of the people. So I just don't think, I suppose it depends on how you ask the question, but I just don't think that when you get into the details of how it takes away our fundamental Second Amendment rights and actually burdens law-abiding citizens and actually may harm people, some of these laws, like was the case with the young woman who testified in judiciary who said that good intention gun laws actually prevented her from defending herself and she got raped. So I would say that there are some, in my disagreements with some of your statements. I also want to point out that there are many things that we can do on a bipartisan basis. And this obviously is not bipartisan, but I am the co-chairwoman of the Women's Caucus in Congress, and I have talked to my counterpart, who's a very nice woman and congresswoman, and we really do want to work on bipartisan solutions to gun violence. And I would say one of those is let's really concentrate on mental health issues. Now, we have done some things in the past. We did a Fix NICS Act, which we passed last year on a bipartisan basis, which really is an attempt to fix the national background system so that local jurisdictions actually report when there's problems, which I think is very valuable. We also did legislation in a bipartisan manner that would protect our schools more. And here's another thing we could do in a bipartisan manner. As you've noted, there was 3.5 million people have been stopped by NICS since 1994 from getting guns, and there was 112,000 were stopped just last year. But you know what? Only 12 of those 112,000 were actually prosecuted. Why? I mean, we have laws on the books now. We're not even enforcing them. So I think that's another thing we can do on a bipartisan basis. And again, this bill, I believe, does more harm than good. And I do think my colleagues are well-intentioned. I do believe that all of us, whether we're Republican or Democrat, want to reduce gun violence. And I reserve the rest of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. First, to clarify one thing, this is bipartisan legislation. We have at least 5 Republicans who are co-sponsoring and supporting this legislation, and I assume my friend doesn't mean to read those 5 Republican members of the House of Representatives out of her caucus. I'm not quite sure what happened in Maine, but I know that there are around a dozen states in the District of Columbia which have already gotten rid of the loopholes that we're going to get rid of today in this federal legislation. My friend also invokes Second Amendment rights. I thought that we had put that red herring to rest in 2008 in Heller versus the District of Columbia. Justice Scalia said that reasonable regulation to screen out felons and fugitives and the mentally unstable is perfectly consistent with the Second Amendment. So everybody on both sides of the aisle favors the Second Amendment along with the rest of the Bill of Rights. So you've got to, if you're going to oppose this legislation, you've got to base it on some public safety rationale and not pretend like anybody's made a constitutional argument, because nobody has made a constitutional argument. Finally, on the question of the domestic violence amendment, I would invite my friend to come on over, and we would gladly have unanimous consent to have her added to the amendment, which is the broader amendment she's talking about. Of course, her amendment was the narrow one, which required you to have a civil protection order before there would be an exception from the provisions of the legislation. She said she was misdirected by the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. All I can say is the legislative process is a treacherous place and a rocky road, especially for people in the minority. I've been dealing with that for several years. But in any event, we would love to have you join the amendment now. Mr. Speaker, I would make that offer, my friend. In the meantime, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, who is the great and distinguished chairman of the Committee on Rules. Mr. McGovern.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. And I want to thank the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for yielding me the time. And I want to thank him for his leadership on this important issue. And let me remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are opposing this legislation that people are watching this debate. And I know many are scratching their heads, wondering what's going on, because what we're trying to do here is close loopholes that allow violent criminals to get access to guns, not create more loopholes. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, I spoke at a town hall sponsored by students at Bancroft High School in Worcester, Massachusetts. Those young people demanded action on gun violence, not unlike other young people all across my district and all across this country. They are terrified, and they are tired of seeing one massacre after another, after another, after another, and they're sickened by the unacceptable high rate of gun violence in this country. We have an obligation to be on their side, not on the side of the gun lobby. In fact, most gun owners agree with what we're doing here today. 97% of gun-owning households support universal background checks. 97%. You just don't see that support. You don't see support like that on very many things. But on this issue, the public is speaking loud and clear. The question is whether Congress is going to listen. Now, my office has been flooded with calls on this year after year after year. And I've heard from loved ones of victims killed and from those injured. I know many of my colleagues can say the same thing. It's heartbreaking. And each of us is in a unique position. We can do more than just listen. We can act. We can actually vote to help save lives. Now, sadly, past majorities have turned a deaf ear. In fact, it has been nearly a decade since the Judiciary Committee held a hearing on a major bill to combat gun violence. When they were in charge, my Republican friends on the other side held a hearing instead on a bill that would have actually brought more guns from out of state into local communities. Their indifference on this issue of gun violence, their silence has been stunning. But this majority is not satisfied with inaction. We will not be cowed by the gun lobby. We are moving legislation in the case of H.R. 8 that has been in the works for more than 20 years. The time for inaction is over. Listen to the young people in your districts. They are not content with a future where gun violence is the norm. They want and they deserve better. You know, last night in the Rules Committee, my Republican friends tried to pass exception after exception after exception. May I ask them for another 30 seconds?
Gentleman is granted 30 seconds more.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
They try to pass exception after exception to this universal background check bill, essentially trying to gut the bill. Well, this is a modest reform in the right direction. We are trying to save lives. We are tired of massacres. We are tired of comforting parents whose loved ones were killed in gun violence. We are tired of inaction. We are tired of the gun lobby dictating what Congress does and doesn't pass. This majority is going to be run by the people of this country, and the majority of the people of this country overwhelmingly support these bills. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote for this rule and vote for the underlying legislation.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Congressman Raskin, for yielding for your tireless leadership. I rise today in strong support of the rule and H.R. 8, Congressman Thompson's bipartisan bill, which makes gun sale background checks universal. Now, this bill is an important step to ensure that individuals who should not be allowed to purchase a gun are no longer able to purchase a gun. Since 2014, nearly 400 of my constituents have died by gun violence. Our community feels their loss every single day. Here are just a few of their names and tragic stories. Davon Ellis. Davon was a star football player and an excellent student at Oakland Tech High School. He was shot and killed while walking home from school. My nephew was walking with him when he was gunned down. Trayvon Godfrey. Trayvon was killed in 2016 while sitting in a car with his friends in front of his home. Every time I think about Trayvon, my heart breaks. Trayvon came to a town meeting that I held on gun violence in January of 2016. Sadly, these heartbreaking stories are all too familiar in communities across the country. More than 30,000 Americans lose their lives to gun violence each year. Shootings now kill as many Americans as car accidents. And that's why this bill is so important. It's a good, may I have 30 additional seconds?
Yes, indeed. I will yield 30 additional seconds.
Additional 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. This bill is a good first step to ensure that our background checks are strengthened and that we keep guns out of the wrong hands and that we close these loopholes. Mr. Speaker, we must end this epidemic of gun violence in our country. This is a national emergency. This bill will save lives. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the rule and yes on the bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I will be prepared to close, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. If we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to make my amendment in order, which would allow domestic violence and sexual assault victims with orders of protection to be exempt from the gun transfer prohibitions. This amendment is crucial to saving lives. As a survivor of domestic violence, I know what it's like to be in fear for our lives. This common sense amendment is clear-cut. If you are a victim with an order of protection, you can borrow a firearm or transfer a firearm to you. It's important because victims don't often have the means to purchase or go pay for a background check. The Democrats have presented a letter from the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence as a reason for not needing my amendment. However, with all due respect, the National Task Force does not speak for every victim, and they certainly do not speak for me. In fact, they never even contacted me, and I have been an outspoken person saying I'm a survivor of domestic violence since I ran for Congress. And I am also the person that sponsored the amendment to extend the Violence Against Women Act, yet they have never talked to me or reached out to my office. The majority offered a political amendment on domestic violence, which I've already talked about, which really does not do any good because the definitions of imminent danger are not defined and will not be carried out and will not be effective. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with the extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, we all want to solve gun violence in the United States, but H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112 will not solve the problem. As co-chairwoman of the Bipartisan Women's Caucus, I am committed to working across the aisle on solutions we can all agree on. However, this is not one of them. We can talk about mental health. We can talk about strengthening the NICS background check system even more. We can talk about enforcing the laws that are already on the books. H.R. 8 will turn law-abiding citizens into criminals by making everyday gun transfers a crime and putting those that seek to protect themselves in jail for wanting to do so. H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112 will place an undue burden on citizens who already have a background check. For instance, security clearance, global entry, state-issued permits, etc. These pieces of legislation put law-abiding citizens in danger by disarming them and emboldening criminals. The bad guys never follow the laws. And in fact, I believe that this legislation violates the Second Amendment of the Constitution because it does not prohibit undue fees for this background checks, and thus someone could not afford them and thus not be able to get a gun to defend themselves. Mr. Speaker, I urge no on the previous question, no on the underlying measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Far from trying to turn law-abiding citizens into criminals, our legislation will save law-abiding citizens from criminals simply by expanding the successful Brady Law, which has been in effect for decades now. The gentlewoman introduces a constitutional argument at the last minute here, saying that our legislation is unconstitutional because there may be undue fees imposed. Of course, those are the fees that are currently imposed under the Brady Law. So I'm afraid that my friend has just made an argument for the unconstitutionality of the current law, which has saved us from more than 3 million felons, fugitives, mentally unstable people, drug abusers, and undocumented aliens from acquiring firearms in the country. Mr. Speaker, our country is a social contract. I know we got a lot of young people here today. We're a social contract. And if you go back and read any of the social contract theorists, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, any of them say we leave a state of nature, which is a state of war, which is a state of war and a state of violence, in order to live in a civilized way. But how civilized is it when tens of thousands of Americans every year are being killed in firearm violence? Every day, 100 Americans, another 100 Americans are killed with guns. In 2017, the highest level in 40 years, we saw nearly 40,000 Americans died from gun violence. That's not a civilized state. That's a state of war. That's a state of violence. And so we know what the loopholes are, and we're going to close the loopholes with this legislation, with our bipartisan legislation, which has support from Republicans. It has support from Democrats. The public opinion polls show that more than 95% of the American people support what we're trying to do here. Close the gun show loophole. Close the private sale loophole. Close the internet loophole. Make sure that everybody who purchases a gun in America is purchasing it only with the universal comprehensive mental and criminal background check. And we have amendments for the discrete exceptions that are necessary, including in cases of imminent violence, including rape and sexual assault by domestic violence. We think that this legislation is excellent legislation that every member of Congress should feel proud in voting for. And with that, we submit to you both H.R. 8, the bipartisan background check act, as well as the bill to close the Charleston loophole so that criminals are not given guns after 3 days. We're able to delay that process in the event that more investigation is needed. And with that, I would yield back the remainder of my time, Mr. Speaker, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The gentleman yields back his time. All time has expired, and the previous question's been moved. The question is on the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I call
Gentleman from
for,
Arizona.
I ask for the yeas and nays to be counted.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having arisen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on ordering the previous question will be followed by a 5-minute vote on adoption of the resolution 145. If ordered. And? The previous question and in addition, ordering the previous question on resolution 144 and adoption of House Resolution 144 if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.